This thing up. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope everybody is about to be on the edge of their seat right now because I know that I am. I have an incredible guest for you today, this evening, depending on where you are in the world. If you're in Europe, you could be at 9 in the morning. If you're in Hawaii, it could be 9 p.m. at night. But no matter where you are, prepare to get stoked. It's a true privilege to welcome Dr. Alexander Lebedev, an acclaimed psychiatrist, data scientist, and entrepreneur who is illuminating the frontiers of psychedelic therapy. With MD and PhD credentials, coupled with over 15 years of psychiatry expertise, Dr. Lebedev offers a unique clinical perspective. But he is also a full stack data scientist, leveraging AI and NLP to unlock healthcare insights. The fusion of humanity and technology defines his work. A serial innovator, Dr. Lebedev has launched startups applying data science and mental health. He is passionate about developing sustainable, resilience-oriented models of care. His mission is to harness technology to foster human flourishing on personal and societal levels. An award-winning scholar, Dr. Lebedev has earned accolades, including the prestigious Kaggle MLSP Schizophrenia Classification Prize and highly competitive NIH neuroimaging training. He publishes groundbreaking research on psychedelics' ability to instill meaningfulness. Beyond scholarship, he provides bespoke tech consulting for organizations and startups seeking to operate more efficiently through AI solutions. His expertise aids business across sectors. For his nuanced work advancing psychedelics healing, his retreat was named among the best psilocybin retreats in Europe by Healing Maps. He charts a prudent, scientifically grounded path forward for this promising but complex field. Please join me in warmly welcoming this accomplished polymath, Dr. Alexander Lebedev. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much, George. I have to admit, I almost blushed when you were spelling out these things. Thank you. That's probably one of the shiniest introductions I've ever had. And thank you for this. Yeah, it's impressive the way you put it. Yeah, pleasure to be here. And as we already started talking, I really appreciate you finding time to meet me. It's 12 time difference between our time zones. I'm based in Sweden, in Stockholm. That's where I'm currently residing and doing my research.
Fantastic. Maybe you could give people a little bit of background on how you got to be in this field and just start off wherever you want to.
Sure. Also, as I mentioned, I have two versions of my story, short and long. So feel free to stop me
Please.
if I go too detailed. So I was born and grew up in Russia. So I'm Russian by origin. I was born in Murmansk. That's the northern provincial town in Russia. And from the very early days, I was into medicine. So my parents told that it was from approximately 5. I cannot verify it, but I I, I take their word for that. So I entered the medical school to prepare to become a medical doctor. So I was coming from a somewhat poor family. It was also a difficult time in Russia, collapse of the Soviet Union. The sentiment of change was all over. So, and I once gave a lecture at UCL on psychedelics, and I called it my reconciliation with the term change. So, because I was from a humble background, so I had to find smart ways of getting my medical degree. So I entered um, the a highly competitive military medical academy in St. Petersburg. So I managed to get a governmental tuition fee for my education, and got into psychiatry very early. I think it was the first year in the medical school. I was blessed with the people I met on my path, and um, very early I got exposed to science. Again, at the end of the first year, so I was my first project in psychiatry and neuroscience was quite intense. So we were working with highly resistant psychiatric patients with obsessive compulsive disorder, with resistant depression, that were undergoing deep brain stimulation. That's a type of neurosurgery for the patients, in which, well, traditional ways of addressing their problems do not work. And that was the beginning of brain imaging in my country of origin. So I had to learn a lot, and I had fascination with math very early since I was a kid. I was growing up. I was born in a family of engineers. I'm the first medical doctor in my family. But I learned to code quite early, and I had to work with the code also as a part of the research. So I was behind, I think, Russia's first fMRI study back in the days. It's also a fascinating story in itself because we
Yeah.
were limited with equipment. But point of the matter, that was probably the first time when I encountered research with psychedelics. Back then, the information was very limited. There was a lot of misinformation about that. There still is, but it was way worse back then. And my teachers in psychiatry have been very open-minded. I discussed that with them, and they said, well, unfortunately, the way it works now, we can put electrodes in resistant patient's brain, but there is no way we can restart these sorts of studies. No one knows why they got shut down. There were allegations that these substances may lead to chromosomal damage and so on. You know, like the story that was all over in the newspapers in the late 60s and 70s. So that was kind of put on hold. Um, but I would say this interest was with me for the entire duration of my education. Also, two of my friends in Murmansk died due to drug addiction.
Mm.
Two of my friends died from heroin overdose. One committed suicide. And That's something that also, I would say, stimulated my interest in psychedelics. Back then, iboga was legal in Russia,
Mm.
so I had my own experience with iboga, just to understand how it works. That was just the beginning of some anecdotal reports about its efficacy for treating addiction. And Interestingly, once I think that was, yes, that was the fifth year in the military medical school. I was really deep into scientific research. I was attending national and international conferences, presenting our work. And at some point, it became clear that I will have to part with the military if I want to, if I am to continue my scientific studies. It was totally supported by, of course, by my teachers because they
Mm.
understood that there is no other way for me to continue this work. So I left. I dropped off from the military and transitioned to the state university, and in some almost magical way, I managed to preserve my government tuition fee. And I eventually graduated from the state university. And at the end of the last year in my medical school at the university, I presented the results of our work at the European Psychiatric Congress in Munich, where I got noticed by my future employers in Norway. So they invited me to do a PhD in Norway, which was focused on application of computational neuroimaging for understanding neurodegenerative disorders, the links between depression and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's or Lewy body dementia, and leveraging machine learning algorithms to enhance image-based diagnosis of age-related neurodegenerative conditions. So that's how some may say, escaped. That's not my word.
Hey.
That's how one of my good colleagues put it. And yeah, so since then I've been working well in the field. So it's been over 15 years since I started. Also, as you mentioned in the beginning, I competed in some machine learning competitions, including the schizophrenia classification challenge, where I took prize. Co-authored one technical paper on one of the novel machine learning algorithms in collaboration with the Royal Holloway London. That's the machine learning center in London. That's where a godfather, in my opinion, of statistical learning theory, Vladimir Vapnik is from. He's the author of Support Vector Machines, one of the most widely applicable and one of the most well-known machine learning algorithms. So I collaborated with them and we published one technical paper. So point of the matter is I kept the interest in psychedelics, and once I saw Imperial College London publishing the studies, I immediately got in touch with them. I had a very specific hypothesis I wanted to test on brain correlates of the so-called ego dissolution phenomena, so which they liked. And we started a collaboration, which resulted in two paper published together, one on psilocybin and ego dissolution phenomena, and another one on LSD. So we were looking into acute changes in brain dynamics occasioned by LSD administration, and managed to discover that acute changes and the magnitude of disintegration of the brain dynamics happening acutely during an LSD session was predictive of lasting personality changes in the personality trait openness observed 2 weeks later. So that was the time of my transition. So I defended my PhD in 2014, and I moved to Sweden. I was invited for a postdoc at Aging Research Center to work with neurobiological and cognitive plasticity. We were studying different means to enhance learning and neurobiological plasticity, mostly in older populations. I co-coordinated and coordinated several research trials, uh, non-pharmacological, pharmacological trials, while keeping this collaboration with Imperial College London. And that was also the time when a non-profit organization in Sweden started called Swedish Network for Psychedelic Science. And I remember how it grew up from the very early days. It started like a small series of meetings in a place held by burners. And ultimately, it grew up in a full-on nonprofit organization, thanks to which we managed to get an approval to run Sweden's first clinical trial with psilocybin for major depression. But back in the days, it was very controversial. I was invited to give different lectures. I was very upfront about my interest and what motivated that interest. Um, but it was not the easiest time back then. It was unthinkable to get any governmental funding for that. Now it's definitely doable, but back then it was more controversial.
Right.
And I used to tell very regularly that psychedelics wasn't my main research field, and every year, as I was saying, it was becoming more and more difficult because I was invited to give lectures at local international universities, and ultimately I got the chance to run my own studies in Sweden. So my first postdoc, after my first postdoc, I started my second postdoc, which very kind of organically and naturally converted into assistant professorship position. Now I hold a permanent senior research specialist position, and that was also the time when I was studying my own studies, looking into recreational use of psychedelics and different kinds of substances with respect to potential risks on psychosis-like traits, schizotypy, which is sort of very roughly speaking, right? It's probably not a very psychiatric way of putting it, but like mild schizophrenia type symptoms. Schizotypal traits are currently classified rather as personality disorders, but it's there is a continuity between schizotypy and schizophrenia. So that's what we were studying as well. Also inviting a subpopulation of psychedelic users to our lab to test them to see whether there are any aberrations in the way they learn. So we modeled their learning abilities computationally, leveraging methods of reinforcement learning. And spoiler alert, there are no aberrations. So if anything, psychedelic users performed better compared to their non-psychedelic user counterpart in a number of tasks, which was interesting. And so yeah, that's what I was continuing to study. And it was again a very peculiar position because back then, and it still, I would say, remains so, that right now the sentiment around psychedelics, I think it's almost a backlash from a scientific community that was the research of which was suppressed for several decades, and now the sentiment around psychedelics is very much positive. And I mean, for the record, of course, I think that psychedelics have a tremendous potential to transform psychiatry and mental health. Maybe we can talk about it later in more details. But for me, it was very important to understand where are the so-called danger zones, where we should be careful, because I genuinely believe there is, in machine learning, there is a very influential paper called No Free Lunch,
Right.
stating that there is no ideal algorithm that would always perform best compared to its alternatives. So there are different data sets for which algorithms work better or worse. And I mean, my own life experience, my scientific experience suggests that the so-called no free lunch principle generalizes for different aspects of research and life. So that was my take on psychedelics, which put me also in a peculiar position. I was still controversial enough for the mainstream science back then, right? That psychedelics were still somewhat controversial, but also some of the colleagues who were very pro psychedelics, they were not sure what to make out of my interest. Is Alex trying to say that psychedelics are dangerous? And of course, that wasn't my intention. So I really value these substances in the context of treatment as really important tools that may help us address a lot of challenging problems related to mental health, and perhaps to some other societal problems. So that's where I stand right now. So after I got a permanent position at my university and the possibility to run studies with psychedelics, I also got a chance to coordinate brain imaging arm of Sweden's first clinical trial with psilocybin, as I mentioned. It was a study that we pulled through the pandemic. It was I'm really proud of making that happen together with the team. But still, I understand that now it's even harder after all of what I said. It's harder to say that psychedelics is not among the main focus of what I do. So what I would say my baby in science, so to speak, right? What fascinates me and intrigues me the most is to extend to which many aspects of our lives, our beliefs, our standards are shaped by context. Take, for example, the numerous child rearing approaches that have evolved over time and were relevant in different periods of our history, right? And or say varying beliefs in conspiracy theories. Um, so that's what fascinates me. That's what I study, and how different beliefs, different ideas can be treated differently in different historical periods and different contexts. So maybe we're gonna also talk today about.
Yeah.
Yeah, already mentioned about the study that we published, and well, some of the tools that we used. It's called conspiracy mentality questionnaire, right? And so I'm gonna read, if you don't mind, I'm gonna read
Yeah, please
some of
do.
the points from it,
Yeah.
and I will leave it to our listeners and perhaps to you to answer them for yourself, uh, without any attempts to introduce any biases. So the conspiracy mentality questionnaire. So point one: I think that many very important things happen in the world which the public is never informed about. Point two: I think that politicians usually do not tell us the true motives of their decisions. Point three: I think that government agencies closely monitor all citizens. Point four: I think that events which superficially seem to lack a connection are often the result of secret activities. Point 5. I think that there are secret organizations that greatly influence political decisions. And so on. There are different tools to assess it, but I want to invite you to reflect on this, right? So would the responses to the questions that I just quoted be the same if asked, for example, before the Cambridge Analytica scandal or after? Would the answers to these questions vary significantly between responders in Russia, Sweden, Iran? So these are the things that fascinate me. Or let's consider another scenario,
Yeah.
right? The efficacy of treatments. When assessing the efficacy of medical psychiatric interventions, we often assume that the effects under the study that are under study are more or less stable. But is this a reasonable assumption? Say, if we launch a study investigating the efficacy of psychiatric medication during a period, say, of economic growth, or initiate a similar study during a crisis or in the midst of a pandemic, for that matter, is it reasonable to expect the same results? So this is the area of my study. This is the main area of my study.
I love it. There's so much in there, man, and it's fascinating to see how long you've been around and how many different areas you've in camps and in areas that you've investigated and been part of. And I've taken I would have to say, like, I'm a 4 out of those 5 questions is a yes. And I maybe it's my heavy psychedelic use, I don't know. But I think not only the conspiracy mentality questionnaire, but you also use the epistemic belief scale,
Yes.
the alternative facts, the truth. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the epistemic belief scale and some of the tools you use before we talk about the study.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So you mentioned the term alternative facts, and for the
Yeah.
record, we were aware of the pun, right? So it was kind of semi-intended. I know who
Yeah.
coined the term. We were fully aware of that, so we wanted to kind of gently implement it into the paper. Uh, and but really, so the point that we were making in the study right now, we don't have good tools to differentiate between tinfoil type,
Right.
tinfoil hat type conspiracy mentality and healthy skepticism. I mean, you mentioned about the responses that you gave to the answers, and by the way, they were on scale from 0 to 100. And my personal stance on it, right? So I firmly believe in the values of freedom of speech, open dialogue, despite all the contradictions. And uh, I've been studying different kinds of personalities, also conspiracy ideation, for quite a long time. And I know even people with with very convinced conspiracy mentality shutting down the conversations around the topic usually does more harm than good. So my personal stance is that I am in favor of a platform where different kinds of ideas, as long as they do not violate other people's uh, lives, freedoms, there should be a platform, and there should be a platform for people to be heard. So back to your question about different tools, with all these limitations in mind, right? That we don't have good ways to differentiate between sometimes healthy skepticism and unhealthy patterns of, well, for that matter, of conspiracy ideation. For the record, the population that we were studying mostly consisted of healthy people. There were people with psychiatric conditions, but the effects were stable regardless of whether or not we include people with psychiatric conditions or not. But it's important to keep in mind
Yeah.
that the majority of people are healthy, even if they score high on some of the clinical skills. Uh, and the tools that we were using, the first tool, the conspiracy mentality questionnaire, has been validated in several countries with quite diverse cultural background. And the second tool that you mentioned is the so-called epistemic belief scale, which uh, in general evaluates how people treat knowledge, right? So what we take as an evidence when analyzing facts, for example, whether we have a tendency to rely more on intuition rather than facts. So there are several facets of this scale. So one, as I mentioned, it's the faith and intuition over facts. So for example, you can a participant can get a question: I trust my gut to tell me what's true and what's not. And my initial impressions are almost always right. These sorts of statements that people have to agree or disagree with. The other facet of it is the so-called need for evidence. And one example of such a subskill would be an invitation to evaluate a statement. Evidence is more important than whether something feels true. So you see, or for example, a hunch or a guess needs to be confirmed with data or with facts. Or a statement, I trust the facts and not instincts when evaluating whether something is true or not. And finally, the third facet of the epistemic beliefs tool is the facet that is related to the political coloring of truth, which is also an interesting topic on itself in light of the global events.
Yeah.
And this particular facet contains statements such as facts are dictated by those in power. What counts as truth is dictated by those in power. Scientific conclusions are often shaped by politics, and that facts depend on political context. So that was another tool that we used. We used many tools in the study that you mentioned, evaluating psychedelic users, and also relationships between personality structure and these sorts of beliefs in relation to different substances. And so what we found is indeed people, among all the substances that we evaluated in different models, psychedelics had a consistent positive or psychedelic use. Both the history of psychedelic use and also the recency of psychedelic use was associated with some of these beliefs, um, and importantly, some of the facets that one may perhaps link to a more arguably pathological ways of treating information, right? Like that different things that seem not connected are intricately connected, secretly, or intricately
Right.
connected. So there are hidden patterns. So this facet, for example, was not prominent among psychedelic users. So and we are open to different kinds of interpretations. And to be fair, once the study was out, there were citations of our study in the context that psychedelic use is linked to higher conspiracy ideation. So we are open to this kind of discussion. I personally stand. My personal opinion is that it rather reflects nonconformism. So I don't
Mm.
see evidence in the study for a pathological kind of conspiracy ideation. But that's what science is all about. It's about discussion and confrontation, argumentation, and discussions on the findings that we have.
The science is never settled. right? There should always be robust argument of people. How else do we know what's really happening unless we get the best people presenting their best arguments and then allowing us to form our own opinions about it? It's so necessary. So I'm not even. So let me just start with this one here. In one of the studies, you talk about the flexible thinking, psychedelic induced flexible thinking. So, philosophically speaking, how should we evaluate ideas or insights that emerge through psychedelic induced flexible thinking? Do they reveal deeper truths or just reflect unconstrained cognition?
Mhm. That's not an easy philosophical epistemological question, right? Again, I'm gonna give uh, as much unbiased opinion as
Please.
possible based on the data that we have, and also give my personal opinion,
I
based
love it.
on my own beliefs.
Thank you.
Um, if we are to take a stance of reductionistic science, right, that assumes that the phenomenology, our phenomenological experience, um, even though it is questioned, but most of the research attempting to link neurophysiology and phenomenology assumes that our phenomenology is a function of our brain activity, and some may argue that since the patterns of brain activity becomes more random or unpredictable during a psychedelic state, some may argue that that's what is reflected in phenomenology, and perhaps in a way it can be if we're talking about peak experiences, more unbiased perception of reality when the condition the cognition is unconstrained, and so there is no ego, there is no dualistic perception of reality, and some may argue that this is a more unbiased perception of the reality we are dealing with. At the same time, having seen several psychedelic experiences, the behavioral patterns that may evolve during a psychedelic experience clearly show that to every psychedelic experience that a person is undergoing, he or she brings their own way of looking at the reality. So, point that I'm making, even though the rational or constrained perception, dualistic perception of reality is dissolved, that also opens up uh, the unconscious dynamics that also introduce a lot into the way people interact with the reality. So in that way, in my personal opinion, psychedelics uh, definitely. Well, I mean, there was a fear, right, in the 60s that psychedelics dramatically change people's well, my good colleague, thanks to whom I started psychedelic research, David Nutt, at one of the interviews at London's Real said, yeah, I mean, isn't it horrible that the substances that influence the way people voted were prohibited for that reason, uh, uh, despite having tremendous potential for medicine and for transforming mental health and neuroscientific research. So in that sense, um, I think psychedelics have remarkable capacity to help people to understand themselves, and but when it comes whether acutely psychedelic experiences make the reality perception more objective, uh, I'm not sure. I think they definitely make people more sensitive to some of the dynamics that may be happening within the group they belong to. They, I mean, they are called mind manifesting, right? So they make things that are not obvious, that are hidden, more obvious and noticeable. So that's their power. I think that's something that is behind their treatment potential. Because of that, something that someone does not want to face becomes more obvious and important to ignore.
Yep.
Um, and again, so there are different ways of working with psychedelics, and it is important to remember that Western civilization um, currently doesn't have a very reliable tradition to work with psychedelics. We used to have, but most of these traditions got lost. And the way we currently approach psychedelics and psychedelic research is very different compared to how they were historically approached and understood. So there are still indigenous communities in South America, for example, in which psychedelics are deeply embedded into the very fabric of their culture, that is a part of conflict resolution, of alignment within the group. So in that way, yes, put in the context, in the cultural context, I do think that psychedelics may help to, if not more objectively look at the reality, but in my opinion, they do have the capacity to aid in conflict resolution, and that's also evident by work of, in my opinion, one of the most relevant work in the field of psychedelic research, led by Leo Rosman from Imperial College London, and he's specifically studying effects of psychedelics on conflict resolution. So they ran a study in the context of ayahuasca retreat,
Mhm.
where Palestinians and Israeli participants were taking the medicine together. Um, Fascinating study, one of the most important studies, I think, in the field. So point that I'm making is that when put in the right context, I do think that there is a power in psychedelics to aid in shaping more resilient um, ways to perceive and treat reality.
Hmm.
Um, and that also brings my point that I often discuss with my colleagues, because if psychedelics are to stay in psychiatry, for for that matter, to make a difference on mental health, they will have to inevitably transform the way we treat mental health and possibly psychiatry itself. Um, for that matter, because right now psychedelics do not fit the way we have been historically approaching mental health. So usually when a psychiatrist prescribes a medication, it's taken to control symptoms, to give people some extra strength to manage the symptoms, to numb the pain, for lack of a better word.
Mhm.
And psychedelics do something different, right? So what we discussed in the beginning, so they make things that may be ignored for a very long time more obvious, and in a way they leave no other choice than just to confront a very very painful experiences, and it doesn't really fit that well into the model of very risk averse psychiatry and mental health that we currently have. And there is a danger, in my opinion, that some of the I don't want to call them mistakes. I think that was an important lesson in the 60s,
Mhm.
but some of the perhaps missteps um, that happened in the 60s, there is a danger that we can repeat them these days. But in my personal opinion, the problem lies in the lack of traditions of working with psychedelics, because I think um, this this field, these substances are bigger than just the medications, and we should be aware of it. I think it's I consider this point as positive rather than negative. So to me, it's good. And for me, it's important to comprehend that because they are bigger than just regular medications that you can get in the pharmacy or by a prescription from your psychiatrist. We also need to be more responsible in the way we incorporate them into the fabric of our culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you bring up the way in which it has the potential to disrupt medicine across the board. And this, you know, I, I've I've got family members that suffer from. I come from a long line of people that suffer from a mental illness. I don't say that to impress you, but just to impress upon you that I get it, on some level. And it seems to me that, at least in the West, medicine at some point decided that the best way to solve the problem is to put a patch on it and not think about it or suppress it. And if we look back, we can be like, oh, we just figured out a way to get through. But now you're right, psychedelics force you, and almost, even though it forces you to confront the issue, it almost does it in a non-confrontational way, because it puts you in this third person perspective where you can look at it from over here. Hey, it's not so
Yes.
bad if I look from over here. Hey, maybe I'm not that bad of a guy. Maybe I don't need to have this constant negative self-talk in my head that says that. Maybe I can let that go. And it's fascinating to think about the way in which language may play a part in it. And that gets me back to this idea of, like, confrontation, psychedelics, and language. And maybe, like, we spoke earlier about how it allows you to see the world differently. Non-constrained thinking versus constrained thinking. Does that have something to do with, like, a default mode network and conditioning? Maybe it allows you to see through the conditioning, the political truths that we talked about. Like, what's the relationship there?
Yes, you mentioned the default mode network, indeed one of the most reproducible and consistent finding that we see as an effect of psychedelics is the so-called dissolution of the default mode network, which was linked to some of the core experiences um, in relation to psychedelics, including ego dissolution phenomena. And indeed, the default mode network is an interesting network which was discovered almost by accident, because most of the studies of the brain imaging studies before the discovery of the default mode network were focused on solving some attentionally demanding tasks. And so researchers consistently saw that while certain regions were engaged during task resolution, so the other set of regions was consistently suppressed. And so some brilliant scientists decided to reverse the problem and worked with some tasks that demand different kinds of or modes of cognition, like imagining the future, initiating self-referential thinking, and interestingly, that's what appeared to stimulate engagement or be associated with engagement of the default mode network. Interestingly enough, we see that this network is consistently overly engaged, especially some components of this network is overly engaged in people suffering from some psychiatric conditions, serious psychiatric conditions, including major depression.
Mm.
And so the brain dynamics of such patients, uh, reflecting the phenomenology of self-defeating thoughts, depressive ruminations, brain dynamics kind of shows the same patterns when their brain activity patterns are stacked in this very narrow repertoire of brain patterns. So we see some resemblance of the changes at the phenomenological level to what is happening at the level of brain dynamics. And since our okay, so it's a speculation. I don't have data to support it, but I think it's reasonable to think. that we shape our societies are shaped by our human to human interactions. So ultimately, what's happening in our brains is one way or another is reflected in what we build, in what kind of connections we form, and what kind of societies we build. So for me, there is nothing mystical or magical in the fact uh, that psychedelics or psychedelic use may be linked to more free or flexible ways of thinking um, with the communities of people who welcome liberty, free speech, free thinking. So for me, it's uh, it's not surprising.
If psychedelics reveal truths outside the system that challenge conventions, do we have a responsibility to integrate these truths responsibly?
Um, you know, there are certain things we can't prepare for. Um, and I I think I can speak for myself. So there are many things that I managed to prepare in my life, but there are many things that I couldn't have envisioned. And I think that applies to different aspects of our life. It's a very
Yeah,
non-scientific response to your question,
it's a great answer.
but I mean, I don't mean to bring extra political tone to our conversation, but
Bring it.
my friends in Sweden asked me a day before the invasion whether I think it's gonna happen, and I said, well, there is no way. So I my honest answer is I don't know. Um, I think, in my personal belief and my personal opinion, that there is more danger in suppressing opinions, suppressing free conversation, especially in an ever-changing world we are currently living in. So I think there is more danger in being overly rigid and inflexible. That's where I personally stand, and I think, if anything, nowadays we would benefit more from a plurality and dialogue of opinions, uh, and most importantly, patience, forgiveness, and respect.
Yeah, that's really well said. I couldn't agree more. It's fascinating, that study between the Palestinians and the Israeli. Like, it's so like, I don't really believe in coincidences, and it's weird that that just happened not too long ago, and then this happens now. It's like the world's talking to us in a way, like, "Hey, dummies, look at this."
Yes.
It's so crazy to me. Just do psychedelics reveal objective truths, or oh, I'm sorry, I already asked you this one. Right? How do we nurture individual autonomy of thought while avoiding fractures and shared understanding of reality that enable manipulation?
That's a valid point, right? So if you
Right?
think, okay, you give everyone the tools to express themselves freely, to tell whatever the hell they want on social media, and then those who control the data flows,
Right.
um, definitely there is an asymmetry in things that different people can do with these freedoms. I wish I had a good answer to that, and I will try
Me
to
too.
think out loud.
Okay, please.
Um, in my opinion, in many aspects of our lives, in science specifically, since I belong to the scientific community, currently there is a certain amount of monopoly of thinking, even though the rationale behind creation of universities was the exact that thing, to promote free thinking and um, and the dialogue of opinions. I am. It saddens me to say that unfortunately this is not the case nowadays. There is no plurality of dialogues in science, unfortunately, currently. There are ways to address this, to, say, to facilitate open dialogues, to provide, this umbrella of open science, to give people platforms to disseminate the research at other places other than some of the peer-reviewed journals. I don't think it solves the problem completely, because, I mean, still, of course, when it comes to how your peers, the society will treat information that is published in one paper or another, is largely determined by a reputation of a particular journal, and having your paper accepted in a respected journal is largely determined by not only the quality of your research, but also whether what you found aligns with the current sentiment that is existing, whether, well, what kind of organization you belong to. And well, unfortunately, this is the reality that we have to deal with. So how to address this? In my opinion, um, there must be more platforms facilitating free speech. I'll give you an example.
Please.
Um, One of the coolest and, in my opinion, well, most valuable paper for me personally was the paper that we published last year on global societal dynamics and relation between economic and some of the global societal processes like unemployment rates, housing prices, and well-being.
Right.
And I preprinted that paper. I wanted to get some early comments on that, and it produced some. It wasn't a pleasant experience. Let's put it this way. So I'm not trying to kind of say that yes, I suffered a lot from that. No, not for that matter. But it definitely made me think that, well, maybe next time I'm not going to preprint this paper, because of the negativity that we got. Now this paper is published in a decent
Yeah.
journal, but it wasn't a pleasant experience. But even with all the challenges, with all the unfairness and difficult conversations, different and really nasty comments that we read sometimes on Twitter back then, an idea of censoring this conversation never crossed my mind. Uh, okay, I learned my lesson, and next time I will not preprint a paper before it is accepted. Yes, it was painful. There are different ways of learning, right? So
Yeah.
I like to give this example. I used to give that example of different kinds of learning, right? So there are different ways to learn that bees can sting, right? Can bite you. Your mother tells you, Alex, don't touch a bee. It may sting.
Hmm.
And or there is another way: you touch the bee, it stings, and you never do that again. We all know which usually works best,
Yeah.
right? So it's an instructed learning versus learning by direct reinforcement. So in that experience, I learned by direct reinforcement. And but point that I'm trying to make. So I think no matter how uncomfortable and painful it is to hear the opinions of people who maybe dislike you, disagree with you, uh, there should always be a platform for free speech, for communication. This free speech and communication cannot be censored, because then we are down the spiral of something way more horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something to be said about lived experience, and even some of the most traumatic experiences can be the ones we learn the most from. I mean, you could argue that suffering is the one thing we all have in common, right? It's
Yes.
in whether it's, you know, people that lost a child or people that lose a loved one or some sort of traumatic event. You see the most unlikely characters sometimes holding hands and crying because they've been through the same thing together. They can be diametrically opposed about everything, but it's the suffering that we share. It's
Yes, it's a very controversial statement by Carl Jung. And yeah, also worth mentioning that I grew up and developed as a hardcore neuroscientist, working with brain imaging and cognitive neuroscience, reinforcement learning. But I did my own analysis in the Jungian framework. So I invented my own psychoanalysis in the Jungian framework. For me, that was very important for, I would say, forming my own point of view on the way I perceive, approach my life and science in particular. There is a controversial statement by Carl Jung, and it's very easy to say it, I think, but with the examples that you gave, you can see why it can be considered as controversial by some. He once stated that the foundation of all psychiatric or mental illnesses, for that matter, is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. It's a powerful and difficult statement. Um, I, uh, I I can say on a personal level that I see some truth in it.
yeah, yeah. It is powerful to say. It's, sometimes if you look at like the DSM, you can see that on some level as a manifestation of the problems of society, like whether it's an eating disorder or it's an anger, misplaced anger or something like that. These all seem like symptoms of a society that is sickened. Not so much the individual's problem, but it's just the symptom manifesting through them as like we're a giant superorganism or something.
To support your argument, there have been some studies looking into quality of life of people suffering from major psychiatric disorders, from psychosis spectrum disorders.
Okay.
That's an important clarification. And in the societies that are not very industrialized,
Mm.
relative to other peers, people suffering from psychosis spectrum disorders do better. Of course, at the global level, the quality of life is, of course, worse in third world countries and less industrialized countries, and of course in the indigenous communities, right? So some of the psychosis spectrum symptoms, which are considered,
Okay.
like one of the most severe conditions, psychiatric conditions, they are more they are more accepted, and um, also there are communities where different kinds of psychopathology or psychopathology-like traits are more accepted, among artists, for
Mm-hmm.
example. And I had some collaborations on the links between psychopathology and creativity. There is a story to tell about that. But
Yeah.
yes, so in a way, there is no psychiatry is a peculiar beast in medicine, right? So it has always been context dependent. So the way, well, even what we call today schizophrenia is very different compared to what was considered and classified as schizophrenia uh, several decades ago. Kraepelins, who is the father, well, one of the godfathers of classical German psychiatry. So he coined the term dementia praecox to describe what later developed into Bloiler's schizophrenia. But point of the matter is that every psychiatric condition you take uh, has undergone tremendous transformation over the course of our history and the history of psychiatry in particular. So there is no single psychiatric condition, well, maybe with an exception of some rather neurological conditions like Alzheimer's,
Mm.
that that hasn't undergone massive transformation in terms of classification. So every psychiatric condition, and I dare to say mental health in general, is very context dependent, and what we consider as norm or pathology has also evolved over time. And in a way, the mental health crisis is a reflection of something bigger, and is very dependent on the state that
Hmm.
of the society that we live in.
I have a question about mechanism of action. I spoke with Brian Roth a while back, and he was sharing some of his findings that are brilliant. But it seems to me, on some level, there's way too many variables that we have no idea about. So sometimes looking for a mechanism of action is like trying to find the true name of God. I don't think you could do it, and so what are we doing? Like, are we ever? I mean, there's too many variables, right? Like, you're not going to find out what's going on, are you? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I've been contemplating a lot on different ways of looking at mechanism of action of psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapy for that matter. Um, and well, there are some things that we see consistently happening on the neurobiological,
Okay.
neurophysiological system level, right? Like I mentioned, some of the changes in the high level networks of the
Right.
brain, changes in the repertoire of brain dynamics, kind of shifting the modes of the brain activity to the states that are opposite to what we sometimes see in people suffering from major psychiatric conditions. There are obvious effects on learning, social learning in particular,
Mm.
neurobiological plasticity that we know. But does it capture the entire repertoire of what psychedelics are capable to do? I don't think so. There are multiple interpretations of how psychedelics work at the individual or psychological level, and I think there is no psychological school, to which psychedelics do not fit. At the early days, people were kind of questioning whether psychedelics and CBT go well together. Today, we
Mm.
know it's one of the most commonly employed methodology in clinical trials. There is a new wave of cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment. ACT is a particularly attractive and popular school in the context of psychedelic assisted therapy. Uh, what I personally think is underlooked in psychedelic research um, is the aspect of psychedelics action that is very hard to measure. I'd like to give an example of a substance addict who I have known personally. It's been a while since we met, but he, after a single psychedelic experience, he managed to stop a long-term heroin addiction.
Wow.
So during the experience, he saw how he is injecting venom into his body, how the body is rotting, decomposing. That dramatically, well, and yeah, I mean, on then directly after he cried,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
within a day, making a decision to transform his life, started exercising, eating healthy, and we how many years we've what was the last when was the last time we met? But several years ago, he
Yeah.
was still in a deep remission. And I mean, if you ask a heroin addict, of course everyone understands that it's destroying their body. It's bad for them, for their community, for their families. But the meaning enhancing properties of psychedelics
Yes.
is something that we don't have so far very good tools to evaluate. So I was once privileged to be a reviewer of one of the papers on that exact topic by invitation from Rick Strassman. Um,
Yeah.
and I do think that it's one of the most interesting and attractive aspects of psychedelics action that we don't pay enough attention to. I think that's because I mean, right now, I think with all the, I think we won't have enough fingers to count all the crises, I think that's
Yeah.
the right way to put it, that we have right now. But I think as much as there is an economic trust crisis, mental health crisis, there is a crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this kind of research and that angle on psychedelics becomes particularly relevant. And I don't think it's only about psychedelics, right? Psychedelics are some of the tools that we have.
Right.
But in general, uh, the ignorance of mental health and science related to mental health, for that matter, to the meaning is something that may underlie some of the challenges that we are facing, in my opinion. And so, yes, I agree with you. There are so many ways of looking at psychedelics. My personal opinion, despite being a neuroscientist, brain imaging researcher, data scientist, I think this is where we need to pay attention. This is what we need to pay attention to.
I love it. When you said that, it seems to me that in the most difficult part of the trip, or the most, which are sometimes the most meaningful parts, when you see the actual event happening and you know it's wrong, is that the manifestation of neuroplasticity in real time? Like, that's your brain rewiring itself in real time when you have that difficult experience, it seems like, right? Or I don't know. You think so?
Uh, to be fair, we don't have data to actually demonstrate that. That would be interesting to see.
I
Um,
think so, yeah.
um, I Yeah, that's interesting because what we consistently see in neurophysiology, in neurophenomenology for that matter, is that often the phenomenology of an experience often mirrors what's happening in the patterns of brain dynamics, and
Yep.
so that wouldn't surprise me. And that's an interesting hypothesis to test. I think that would be an interesting thing to observe, and uh,
Can you
I'm
cite me
curious to
when you
see.
do it?
Yes, yes, I'll make sure to do that.
Okay, but this is exactly why the experiment where they want to try to take the difficult part of the trip, taking the difficult part out of the trip is taking the neuroplasticity out of the trip. If that hypothesis is true, right? It's not gonna work.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, also, as you know, there is some research going on trying to take the psychedelic part out of the
Right, right.
psychedelic action, and my personal opinion on that is humble curiosity.
Love it.
That's well, I think that's a healthy attitude that I have. I mean, if that's the case, I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask me, do I think that psychedelics are good tools for everyone? No, I don't think so. I think there are probably people, conditions to where psychedelics, in especially in wrong contexts, can do more harm than good. For instance, people experiencing acute trauma.
Mm,
So my personal stance is that that's where one has to be particularly careful introducing extra crisis like state or extraplastic state when there is already some profound transformations perhaps going on and people are processing that. I mean, there are other tools, like MDMA, for
yeah.
example, that has been shown to be good for processing trauma. But that's perhaps a story for another conversation. But what I wanted to say is that there are aspects where we need to be wary of how we introduce psychedelics. Um, yes, and yeah, I don't know if that answers the question
It
that
does.
you
It's
that
beautiful.
yes.
In your view, is the experience of meaning a byproduct of changes induced by psychedelics or the core driver of their therapeutic benefits?
Um, to be fair, right? So this question, the way you post it, it assumes the duality, right? The experience and biology. And there are different ways, right, of looking at the mind-brain relationships that I briefly touched upon in the beginning,
Right.
right? So sort of from a conceptual level, right? So there are points on panpsychistic, there are panpsychistic views, right? That consciousness is a
Universal and
yeah,
everything.
is a characteristic, is a fundamental characteristic of the universe or the matter. And there is a emergentism that states that, well, there should be a certain state of a matter and which, well, some properties that were not present in its elements start to manifest. And one example is a liquidity of water, right? So there is no liquidity in water molecules. It's the way they interact makes the bigger system to manifest novel properties. And uh, there are reasons to believe that that could be the case for some of the phenomena like consciousness. And I've been a part of several discussions on consciousness, on experience. In my opinion, very often these discussions stumble upon poor definitions. That a lot of discussions go nowhere because the participants talk about consciousness in different terms, right? And also when it comes to emergentism, there are different ways. There are different emergent phenomena, right? So the so-called hard emergence or soft emergence. So say if you ask I don't know, a panpsychist, well, do you really think that a table on which my laptop stands is conscious? And he or she would, well, of course not. I mean, yes, well, it probably has some characteristics of what we call the proto-consciousness, for example, but the system is not complex enough to be self-aware and to defend a dissertation in neuroscience for that matter, right? And on the other hand, some of the emergentists would talk about the proto-consciousness elements, say, perhaps liquidity is present as a potential energy in the water molecules as a possibility for manifestation for that matter. So the point that I'm trying to
Right.
make, right? So it's a very long intro to the answer that I'm about to give, is that this question assumes that well, there is a dualistic and causal relationship between mind and matter, and the changes that are happening. And the point that I wanted to make, that's also an assumption, right? So we don't really
Right.
know what's causing what. We know that some of the things that are happening in parallel. Well, you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, right? So you did not refer to that term specifically, but you correct me if I'm wrong. You were kind of getting there about the synchronicities, and
Yep.
linking the current global events and the studies with
Yep.
psychedelics. So a point that I'm making, I think I think on the questions when we don't have enough data to support a particular causal link, it's best to remain agnostic and welcome different ways of looking at it. Uh, I, I think if you're asking my personal opinion, I think the changes in the meaning that are happening and what we observe at the biological level are different sides of the same coin.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me. Thank you for the answer. It's a fascinating concept and it's fun to talk about. And I love this idea of meaning and psychedelics and transformation and language and behavior. Like it's just a fascinating topic, all of them. And what
Yes.
could virtual reality simulations of meaningful psychedelic experiences provide similar benefits without ingesting substances, in your opinion?
Um, I do think that there are other ways
Mhm.
to bring transformative changes to people's life, to people's psyche, without psychedelic, without ingesting any
Right.
substances. For example, I got exposed to breath work very
Mm.
early in when studying psychiatry, and like that was a very brief exposure. And to be fair, I was fairly skeptical
Okay.
about it. Uh, but later on, when when I really did it with an experienced instructor, I understand that it has a tremendous capacity for transformation, and needless to say, other kinds of practices. Uh, I mean, my a part of my life journey has been martial arts.
Mm.
That have been a part of my life since I was 5, and definitely that's a very important part that helped me to see myself better, to learn about myself through my opponents.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, that's also a something that brings a lot of transformation to
Right.
my life. So, and in that sense, to answer your question, I think yes, whether it's a virtual reality. I have a good colleague, working on a startup in Sweden, specifically trying to emulate or just leverage virtual reality for mental health. I think it has a lot of promise. There are obvious use cases that are already at place, like exposure therapy for phobias.
Mm.
Uh, to what extent they can actually reproduce a psychedelic experience, I don't know, and I'm not even sure if that's what needs to be done. Because yes, there are ways to influence brain dynamics with stimulation,
Mm.
and we are getting better and better at it. um, there is some controversy around the magnetic stimulation, to what extent it can actually
Mm.
alter brain
Right.
dynamics, but I mean, there are good reasons to believe that it is possible on some conditions. And I think definitely virtual reality, even without stimulation, have the capacity to alter our mental states. I mean, sounds can alter our mental
Yeah.
state. Exposure to nature can alter mental states. So yes, to answer your question, I think it is also an interesting technology that has future for our well-being and mental health. Like any technology, we just need to be mindful of how we leverage them. But I am rather positive, as long as every technology we
Yeah.
employ, we approach with respect and care.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how it seems that for it seems that there's a pretty big medical container around psychedelics. But possibly in the future, I could see an avenue for optimization, whether it's through athletes or whether it's through studying, or I think that there could be these new emergent fields where you can use them for more than just medical reasons, because medical is kind of a way of optimizing in itself, right?
I agree with you. I agree with you. I as I mentioned, and I think in the beginning of our conversation, that the way psychedelics have been used historically is very different
Hmm.
compared to how we
Yeah.
treat them right now. Right now, in most of the clinical trials, we are talking about a setting consisting of one patient, two therapists. Even though at this stage it's probably or used to be justified for research matter, it's a very unnatural way of approaching a psychedelic experience, and virtually all the communities and historical use we can discover, whether that being historical references or what's happening, what we have now in some of the indigenous communities. So South America, for example,
Right.
it has always been a group experience, a communal experience, embedded into the very fabric of culture, community, uh, families. And a couple of weeks ago, I attended a men's circle retreat for the first
Yeah.
time in my life. I've never
Nice.
done that. Um, but I also have a community of jiu-jitsu that I've been practicing for a very
Mm.
long time. That's also a very strong community, and I do think that uh, at some point, that would be curious to see how psychedelics or any transformative experiences
Yeah.
for that matter, not necessarily substance assisted, or well, anything that entails ingesting any mind altering substance. In general, transformative experience. And that retreat was, did not entail any intake. So that was a purely conversational body practice type retreat. um, I think that definitely strengthens the bonds that people form, and
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that has been a long overdue in the way we function as a society at large.
Yeah, there's a sort of oneness people speak about through psychedelics, and a lot of the times on psilocybin, it seems that you become aware that, at least I've spoken to lots of people who have had the epiphany that you don't come into this world, you come out of it. Usually on a high dose psychedelic or psilocybin trip like this. I don't know. It's this weird understanding or connection to nature and other people in some way. Is that something that you have noticed in working with them?
Yes. So the study that I would love to run at some point is to see the relationship between quality of experiences and the connection to nature.
Mm.
There are studies showing that very simple stimulation, hearing sounds of nature, looking at patterns of
Mm.
nature, makes a difference on your mental states.
Mm.
Um, well, needless to say, there are some studies happening at my university showing that the place you live in, defined in the greenness index that you can extract from Google Maps, right? So you know how much exposure to nature you have on daily basis is very delicately and closely linked to your well-being and a number of other well-being related aspects of your life. Of course, there are a number of confounders, right? Your income, your origin, but well, the more data we collect, the more clear it becomes that connection to nature is very good for all aspects of our life. And right now at the university that I belong to, we have like in-house gardens.
Yeah.
There are trees inside. So well, we are figuring it out, and it becomes crystal clear that it's very unnatural for human beings to separate ourselves from nature, in this stone jungles of the cities,
Yeah.
and we need to find a balance how to bring our connection to nature back. And in that regard, it's very interesting to contemplate on psychedelics in this context, right? So what we
Yeah.
know very well about psychedelics is that they are making people tremendously sensitive. What we were discussing in the beginning about different aspects of our perception of our life.
Mm.
And well, of course, in the indigenous communities, psychedelic experiences are also part of connecting to nature. So, of course, every culture, and I would argue every culture, it's just some cultures kept this link and other cultures
Yeah.
uh, forgot this link. There was that thread connecting non-ordinary states of consciousness to nature, whether that being the spiritual realm of
You're right.
nature, whether that being the general idea that nature is a natural healer. So that was the classical approach to medicine, in ancient Greece, right? So
Mm-hmm.
doctors communicate with nature to open up a possibility for nature to heal. So this, I would say, this has been around and understood by scholars, by society for many years, and I do think it's a very important aspect of action of psychedelics, and in general, the lost connection to nature is something that, in my personal opinion, is dangerous to ignore.
Great points, and it brings up a fascinating question about language. When you look back at some of the history textbooks and they ask some of the indigenous tribes, how did you figure out how to make ayahuasca? Oh, the plants told us. When we start talking, Jeremy Narby has a great book called The
Yes,
Cosmic Serpent, right?
love it, love this book.
Phenomenal. They talk about understanding the antidote to this snake is by, oh, the plants tell us, and the anthropologist like, well, what do you
And
mean?
isn't it incredible that he
Yeah.
started as a as a hardcore Western anthropologist? Yeah, it's yeah, I love this book too. Yes.
So on some level, is it possible that maybe like some of the psychedelics, like, or maybe some of the entheogens are like exogenous neurotransmitters that allow us to communicate with nature? Is that too far out there?
Um, I mean, classical psychedelics, right? So they their molecular structure resembles the one of serotonin. And
Right.
in one of the conversations with one of my colleagues, we kind of joked, yeah, I mean, we're all tripping on
Right.
serotonin. And yes, there are, as I mentioned, there are different ways of to alter our perception, but ultimately, yes, the way we perceive reality is determined
Yeah.
to a large extent, uh, well, the way our chemistry functions. And I mean, there is nothing magical or mystical in the fact that what's happening in our brain dynamics is very delicately and closely linked to the way we perceive reality. And yes, so we know that at the constrained cognition, we perceive a
Yeah.
very, very narrow
Yeah.
aspect of our reality. I don't know. I don't know what to make out of. I mean, I have a lot of respect to different ways of looking at the reality, right? So I dedicate my life to study different ways of looking at the reality, and interpret and study how we approach different beliefs
Hmm.
and facts in different contexts. So
Yeah.
that's why when I say I respect different views on reality, I genuinely believe so. I am a very non-religious person, but my best friend is an Orthodox priest. And I do think that there are different ways to perceive reality and to walk you on path, right? So
Yeah.
there are multiple ways to enlightenment. There are multiple ways to happiness, to healthy and authentic life. And as long as the worldview, a particular
Yes.
worldview, does not entail any destructive activities or obviously harmful activities for others, I think it's healthy to be inclusive. And actually, when I say about potential links to some dangerous activities, again, full disclosure, this point of view has been questioned by many anthropologists, right? So the way we look at some of the indigenous or historical accounts of some indigenous cultures like Aztecs,
Hmm.
it's important that this history that we know is mostly written by people who
Mm-hmm.
obviously had a conflict of interest, right?
Yeah.
uh, and they picture a very bloody society of Aztecs, the society ruled by really scary, bloody rituals, and which psychedelics played arguably a massive role, right? So the emperor of Aztecs allegedly interacted with gods by means of psychedelics, and so that was, according to some accounts, a society that was very harsh according to our standards. So the point that I'm trying to make is that uh, there are different ways to
Right.
perceive and form the picture of reality, and some of the ways of perceiving reality uh, may look very bizarre and horrible in the eyes of a 21st century Westerner. Whereas, probably if you tell Aztecs or I don't know, any indigenous communities who lived in America, I don't know, several centuries ago, about the way we are living now, uh, they would probably think that we all gone mad.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Orwell's quote where he says, he who controls the future controls the past,
Yes.
and he who controls the past controls the present." Right?
Yes.
History, history is all bullshit. It seems like, it's, I don't know. It's crazy to think about. Maybe that's my conspiratorial thinking and my nonconformist attitude of, but on some level, I think looking at history is a great way for people to begin to form their own opinions. And you need look no further than the calendar. Like, why is October the 10th month when Oct is the first part of it? Why is December the 12th month when Dec? You know what I mean? Like, all of
Yes.
a sudden, you're like, something doesn't add up here.
Yes. Yes. I mean, yeah, there are many things I agree with you on. I mean, I do think that, well, there is a famous quote: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned
Doomed
to
to
repeat
repeat it.
it."
Yes.
Yeah.
Well said.
Uh, yeah. But I do think that when it comes to approaching something like even hardcore facts,
Right.
it is important to be open
Yeah.
to different opinions. And well, one of my teachers in psychiatry, when presenting some of the findings, put it beautifully, specifically pertaining to the specialty, to my specialty, right? So he said, to me, a qualification and professionalism of a psychiatrist, to a very large extent, is determined by the ability to calmly and respectfully listen an opinion that one disagrees with. And I
Mm,
think that that is applicable to any
yeah.
aspects of our life.
That's I'm gonna remember that. That's beautiful. I think it speaks volumes. You mentioned in one of your studies that psychedelics may help rewrite negative thought patterns. Could they also unintentionally overwrite positive patterns or moral foundation?
I well, I can only speculate, right? So
Sure.
I think there is that sentiment around psychedelics, right, that they only bring you know, love and positivity. I am not sure. I'm not sure. Uh, Among psychedelic users I've encountered, um, I encountered different people. Um, I think there is a there is a great risk of treating psychedelics like a spiritual bypass
Mm-hmm.
or an
Mm-hmm.
excuse of not doing your work, so to speak. And
Yeah.
I mean, I um, of course, psychedelics played an important role in my life. You know, not only as a
Sure.
research, but also as a as a personal experience. Uh, but I wouldn't diminish the importance of the of personal work
Yeah.
that everyone needs to do. You know, like Alan Watts saying, you know, you got the message, hang up the phone. But you know, to answer your question directly, I do think that they can change patterns
Yeah.
of thinking. They can change beliefs, and I don't think it's necessarily always for the good. Uh, that's why it's very important to do that in the right context, right? So for example, because people are becoming very
Yeah.
sensitive, and you know, sometimes during psychedelic experiences people may confront very challenging thoughts patterns. You know, some people
Yeah.
may remember or think that they remember real facts from their life, whereas they may not be the real
I've heard it.
facts,
Yep.
but they may be very traumatizing or re-traumatizing for some people. And that's why it is very important to know how to process this information, because if some of these challenging experiences are left unprocessed, I do think that they can inflict harm on people's lives and influence potentially potentially damaging patterns of people's behavior, and may even have uh, bad consequences for mental health and well-being of people and of those around them.
It's interesting to think about patterns and behavior. And there's a great book by Marshall McLuhan called The Gutenberg Galaxy, and he talks about how typography fundamentally changed the way we see model reality. It gave us ideas like exact repeatability and things like this. And one of the premise of the books is that the printing press changed our sense ratios as human beings.
Yes.
And in a strange way, it seems that psychedelics may be doing the same thing. Like we're able, like, and if you just think about shifting your sense ratios a little bit, that fundamentally changes the way you can model reality. Like
Yes.
I think that's a fascinating thing to think about. Do you think that's plausible?
I do think that psychedelics may dramatically transform the way we perceive reality. Yes.
Right.
Um, and uh, and I mean, I almost dare to say they will do that.
Yeah.
Because the genie is out of the bottle now,
Yep. Yep.
and I well, because of the effects of
Yep.
these substances and these experiences, it's very hard to ignore, and very hard to shut it down. I mean, we had a history of that happening.
Yes.
There are different opinions on why it happened. Um, but I mean, to answer your question, yes, I think it's almost inevitable. And to what extent it's actually, again, the effect of psychedelics, or it's just
Right.
psychedelics came at the right moment in history, I
Yeah.
don't have the answer. Uh, I have a good colleague working in the drug addiction clinic in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, with Iboga, and we've been discussing a lot the problem of addiction, and different experiences uh, that people undergoing different kinds of treatments for addiction were having. And an interesting observation that he made. So I also observed that in some medical practice that I had. But well, to be fair, that was him who kind of coined that, and I fully agree with that. That quite often he said it's not necessarily the quality of the experience during a session that determines the outcome. The best changes that he said we observed, and most durable changes that we observed, he said, were mostly happening in people who had to undergo a lot of things before getting to the clinic.
Mm.
Coming from a different side of the world, sometimes having challenging situations just to be able to visit the clinic,
Yeah.
trying different kinds of treatments, really fighting for that, putting a lot of personal efforts into that, having supportive family, and for them, an ibogaine experience was just a final tipping point that
Mm.
they needed. Um, that was just a part of a large path that they walked, that just came in the right moment and in the right place. And perhaps that's what's currently happening, and maybe psychedelics is just a potential part of this story. I personally think psychedelics are powerful tools, but I mean,
Yeah.
I ended up building my own startup in Sweden, working with dreams, for example, primarily, right? So, and I do think there is a transformative power of non-ordinary states of consciousness that our society came to ignore for too long. That being a psychedelic experience, that being a realm of dreams, that being the realm of other kinds of non-ordinary states of consciousness, and I think it's my perhaps job now, and in a way a responsibility to figure out what we can make out of it, and and humbly do my part on uh, on what I can do on this matter. But to answer your question, I do think uh, non-ordinary states of consciousness in general have a tremendous capacity for shifting the way we interact, the way we connect with each other, with nature, and the way we shape our reality together.
I've noticed a trend. I was speaking a while back with Dr. Erica Dick, and she was mentioning some of the ways in the late 50s and 60s when they were working with patients, they had a way of measuring subjectivity that seems to be absent today. And they would use questionnaires with, it was mostly men they were working with, but they would go to the wife and be like, is your husband more or less of an asshole now? But they would find ways to incorporate the family and real subjective, but like mattering subjective. I see it, and I don't know if I'm willing this to happen or I'm seeing trends, but is that, can we get more of that going forward? Or do you think that designing that into studies would be beneficial?
hmm One thing I wanted to say, well, first, I do think it's very relevant to take into account the
Yes.
subjective aspect of people's perception, and I think there is a danger of taking the person who is in suffering out of the equation when talking about mental health. It's bizarre, right? Uh, to be fair, there is a trend. There is an existing trend in mental health research to bring back the subjectivity.
Mhm.
For example, some of the scales that we are using today, I mean, for a long time, one of the most popular scales to evaluate depression was Hamilton depression scale, which is
Mm.
usually evaluated primarily, the most emphasis is put on a psychiatrist doing the evaluation. Now, one of the most popular scales is QIDS, that is primarily a subjective scale. Uh, and right now, we are bringing back the importance of subjective reports about evaluating our own mental health, our take on that. Personally, I am, uh, in my opinion, the subjectivity of evaluation and particularly questionnaire-based assessment is a double-edged sword. So I think I'm not, well, to be like bluntly upfront, I'm not a fan of questionnaire-based
Right,
assessments.
right.
Uh, I think quite often your behavioral patterns can tell more about
Mm,
mental health than what you say in a morning following sleepless night, or I don't know, an argument with your girlfriend, or whatever after a sickness. The point that I'm trying to make, for example, we know that the amount of time people spend outdoors, number, just like very simple measure, number of steps, is very
mm,
closely linked to to how well we are doing, what kind of food we consume, what kind of stuff we are buying, right? How we interact with people, what kind of language. So you mentioned about language we
yeah.
use in our interactions, right? So there was a study that linked uh, the usage of self-referential speech patterns
Mm,
and the amount of time you spend talking with self-referencing is linked to poor outcomes of mental health. And that's true again. So bringing
yeah.
back to the points that we discussed previously, right? So the rumination, the self-defeating thoughts, this self-centeredness, which is also reflected in the patterns from brain dynamics, is also reflected in the way we communicate, the way we talk. So my personal opinion is that ultimately, of course, it's important to have this broader aspect of mental health, right? So it's a personal mental health, the state of the family. I mean,
Yeah.
speaking about kids, right? So quite
Yep.
often, uh, what the symptoms that a child is manifesting is not only a symptom of a child. In the vast majority of cases, if not all the cases, that's the symptom of a family.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say yes, that's the families and the parents' responsibility for the only for the children's mental health, but the point that I'm making that mental health expands beyond personal well-being, personal brain dynamics, personal reflections. It's always a reflection, and also very context dependent. So my personal opinion is that there will be, or I think there must be, a trend towards contextualizing mental health in different
Mm.
occasions. Thinking, for example, in what context a person with a certain characteristics. I mean, so say I like to give an example on ADHD, right? You have a
Okay.
person, you have two people with the same magnitude of symptoms, and you can kind of evaluate the presence of ADHD symptoms by some scales. And one person is an athlete, another person is an office worker. One would get a diagnosis, and the other one would not, because they live in very different contexts with very different demands, with very different focuses in their life. Uh, and so I do think that in general, not only the context of partners, but in general, the broader context of the mental health that the person is living in is very important for determining, for also for helping people to live, you know, to take care of their well-being better. But when it comes to the use of technology in the assessment, I do think that there is already an existing trend of for leveraging natural language processing to get information from natural behavioral patterns, from natural speech on how people are doing. Um, yes, and also, there was, I don't know if you know, there was a recent study based on Compass Pathways data from a clinical trial that evaluated with leveraging natural language processing of interactions, patient therapist interactions, and they objectively uh, with the technological tools detected that what we've known for quite a while, right? That the rapport, the personal contact that the therapist has with the patient is tremendously important for outcomes. And so it's interesting that the study is actually coming from a company representing the pharmaceutical players in the psychedelic space, right? And but again, so it shows objectively leveraging modern technology that the therapy part, or okay, so for that matter, the personal connection part. Okay, so I'm not here to say that the only way of approaching psychedelics is through full-on therapy, but at least we know that the subjective aspect of treatment, of the way people establish their connection with the therapist, with each other, is very important for the treatment outcomes.
So this brings back the idea of the indigenous ceremony and rites of passage. And if you find yourself in a heightened state of awareness and there's an elder who's already been through it, and maybe your younger brother who's looking up to you to see you go through it for the first time, like that's a tremendous container of learning right there. We're real, you have everything you need. You have the old version of you and the younger version of you. And there you are right in the middle, like depending on which one you are. But man, it's such a just hearing the idea of speech patterns makes me think about life patterns, makes me think about evolution. Like I really, I think it would be fascinating to do some studies on the way in which psychedelic ceremonies and consumption of psychedelics have different outcomes in those settings. Right? It's mind blowing, man.
I agree. For me, another aspect that has been largely ignored or under investigated, let's put it this way, is interpersonal dynamics during such interventions or shared experience, and how it is related to the outcomes uh, of of work with psychedelics. Because I do think, it's my hypothesis, let's put it this way, that the bonds and the interpersonal connection that is formed during such interventions is very important. And I think there are good reasons why psychedelics are used in the communal setting.
Yeah.
And to me specifically, I mean, we were running a company organizing this, harm reduction services in the Netherlands, and that was a ceremonial setting. We so that was the company was started by four medical doctors, and we were working with traditional space holders who started work with, with this medicinal substances for many years. And in indigenous communities, just to be able to facilitate your own
Yeah.
ceremonies, you have to help out at the ceremonies for about 10 years. You need to
Right.
study that, and so it has always been done in a communal context. And I think that's something that has a tremendous healing potential. This interpersonal connection that has been lost in current
Yeah.
mental health, that is quite often largely indifferent to what happens to a psychiatric patient, what he or she gets discharged. There are exceptions, of course,
Sure.
but when I was doing my residency in psychiatry in Russia, I said, I mean, you can. I'm quite sure you can teach a monkey to prescribe antidepressants, and but what is really important is to communicate to a patient, what happens next, where they can get help, how they can get support, how they can navigate,
Mm.
especially if they're suffering from a major psychiatric condition, how they can get help, how they can build their life, in the light of challenges that they're facing, and in the light of their personal characteristics that they have, how they can find the right context and in which they can live a healthy life. So that's what is challenging, and that's what we so far haven't been very successful on.
Yeah. My grandpa used to say, if you want a new idea, read a really old book. And sometimes it's just like looking back to the people that have been doing this before us. Like, oh, we lost our way right here. Okay, let's go back, or maybe this is what we're missing. It's
I agree. I agree. My favorite book on psychiatry, and I read a lot of books on neuropsychiatry, but my favorite and most transformative book for me as a professional in mental health uh, was General Psychopathology by Karl Jaspers. Karl Jaspers was a classical German psychiatrist. He was an interesting character. So he's a recognized classic in psychiatry, but also a recognized classic in existential philosophy. So the book that he wrote, um, uh, it's a massive book.
right.
It's one of the probably biggest books in psychiatry. It's mostly on phenomenology of a wide variety of psychopathological experiences, but it also has a massive section on methodology of what we study, the psyche, mental health. What are the traps that we can get into when trying
Mm.
to over-explain phenomenology by means of neuroscience, by means of biology and physiology. So that has been a very influential book for me, and I still believe that was probably the most important book in psychiatry for me. And
Yeah.
it was written in the beginning of 20th century, just in the foundation of during when the modern psychiatry was just trying to find its own place in the medicine.
It's fascinating to think of. As we spoke about speech patterns earlier, and sometimes in the heightened states of awareness, you'll see these radical geometric shapes sometimes, and whether it's a three-dimensional pyramid or some sort of geometrical anomaly. Like, wow, what is that? Is that possible? Do you think that has something to do with language? Is that like on some level? Because there's also the same aspect of the ineffable. Like, you can't bring back in language what happened to you at times, but you can almost bring back the idea of that image. Do you think that those images that you see in language are somewhat connected?
Well, there are studies, right, that would investigate effects of psychedelic on perception of symmetry, and as you mentioned, there was some systematic research done on um, on specifically perception of these patterns of edges,
Mm.
geometric shapes, and well, because of what we discussed, right? So the psychedelic state is a mode of very unconstrained cognition, and in terms of
Mhm.
perception, um, well, what we know is that there is some resemblance of these patterns to the way our visual cortex is structured. So when uh, let's put it this way, the lower level brain system become more engaged into the activity during these states, so there is more place of the basic aspects of our perception and the way we deal with the reality. And we know
Mm,
for many years, there was a belief that we are just passive receivers of reality, right? That we are just the observers, which is clearly not the truth. So the amount of feed forward projections to higher perceptual networks of the brain is for many regions is larger than the receiving end of it, right? So we constantly, our brain and our cognition for that matter, but let's speak in terms of the cognitive neuroscience. Our brain, as actually once stated by Carl Friston, is the inference machine, constantly making predictions about reality, right? You step on a non-moving escalator on and your body immediately tries to readjust, even though you
right.
see with your own eyes that it's not moving. So our brain constantly makes predictions about what's coming next. That's related to some of the biases that we form. That's related to different aspects of life, and it's important component because there are so many things happening in our perception, and it's one way or another we form the model of our world.
Right.
And some of the signaling from low level systems, from our fear circuits, from our some basic aspects of perception of reality in our of our regular waking consciousness. These activity patterns get suppressed and filtered out from the perception, and in an unconstrained state of condition, so we see these aspects of brain activity, they are being brought back, or they are being introduced to the mental space. And that's what we seem to observe. That's what we observe in the phenomenology, and that's what people describe. So it's also interesting that there are some psychedelics that are more linked to these sorts of visual phenomena, like DMT, for example, right?
Mm,
It's known for being associated with these patterns. And remarkable, isn't it, that we see some of these DMT-like patterns in some ancient
yep.
cultures, in some of the paintings of different religious places. So, and I do think that, well, first, in a way, these patterns reflect, in general, the basic foundations of the way our visual system is involved in building the reality, or the visual aspect of reality perception. Um, and yeah, so I think it's another fascinating and interesting aspect of the unconstrained cognition.
You think most people have heard about like Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory about how what is your thoughts on that?
Um, in my opinion, I don't see. Okay, so I respect Terence McKenna a lot,
Sure.
right? So he said a lot of interesting, and he was definitely a prominent and interesting figure in the space. My personal opinion, I don't see enough evidence for that. I mean, as someone who is open to different ideas, I find it fascinating
Yeah.
that mushrooms, in a broad sense, uh, have amazing properties that, on some within some frameworks, can be recognized as having collective intelligence.
Yes.
That's something that fascinates me.
Yeah.
Whether in some bizarre way it was a well the this uh this communion of our mammal biology and the mushroom biology somehow manifested in a new form of cognition. I don't know. I think that's a beautiful idea to contemplate on. If we find ways to actually somehow verify it, I mean, I am open to accepting this as a possibility. If I were to speak like a scientist, no, I don't think we have enough evidence to claim this, but I do think it's, in general, I think there are many things that we still do not understand about species that we live so closely with, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. If meaningfulness is key, should psychedelic therapy focus on guiding patients to directly cultivate it rather than just treating symptoms?
Oh, well, I think when it comes to working with psychedelics, it's very hard to only focus on symptoms that a person is manifesting, right? We can measure,
Right.
and that's what we do at clinical trials, right? So a
Right.
person comes with certain symptoms of depression. We evaluate it before and after. But well, I mean, everyone who worked with psychedelics understands that, you know, even if you want to only focus on symptoms, well, good luck. You know, it's impossible. You know, it's like a Pandora box. You know, you start working with psychedelics, and there are more underlying things. You know, for example, and uh, well, very quickly we may realize that that's just the tip of an iceberg. Uh, I personally think that reframing approaches to mental health to for lack of a better word, I know it's a very abused term for more holistic way of looking at our well-being and mental health. Uh, 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 by which I mean, right, focusing on our biology, psychology, and also spirituality is something that we need to do. Uh, and when it comes to meaning, I personally stand by that. So I think that meaning enhancing properties are very important. And
Yeah.
in my opinion, to a very large extent, to build a resilience or sustainable well being is a lot about finding meaning in the ever changing and chaotic unpredictability of the world.
Do you have any thoughts on using AI in next generation drug discovery?
Yes, I well, yeah, there have been some attempts, right? You know, there is a massive field of computer aided drug discovery. So,
Right.
for example, I worked with computer aided diagnostics, image based diagnostics, and you know, one of the papers that we've published was written with a good colleague of mine from the Netherlands, working with computer aided drug discovery. So there are different ways of looking of doing that. Sorry, I'm just
Yeah,
gonna
no worries.
line the phone.
I'm taking up a lot of your time, man. Are you okay?
It's fine. It's fine. I'm enjoying the
Yes.
conversation
Me
a lot.
too, man. Me too. Thank you.
Yeah. So what was I? So I was talking about the computer-aided drug discovery and the role of AI in drug discovery. Yes, for sure. You know, we already see this thriving.
Right.
We already have the first fruits of this research, and yeah, I mean, this is well to that question, I can easily give a definite yes answer. So we already see it happening.
Is there any speculation or is there any ideas on or potential thoughts on what a next generation psychedelic drug would be?
Um, I think we have really good psychedelics already
Me too.
that are largely under investigated. Okay, so I'm gonna give my own opinion, right? So
Okay.
I'm
Awesome.
all pro, you know, discovering new
Right.
substances. There is tremendous amount of work that Sasha Shulgin has done. I think there is a
Yes.
massive amount of work we need to do just revisiting some of his fascinating
Yep.
work. Uh, and Well, I talked with a colleague of mine that actually managed to rediscover some of these discoveries leveraging AI, and so with simulation, leveraging genetic algorithms. Uh, but what I want to say is that there is a massive amount of stuff we still need to understand about the psychedelics that are available.
Right.
And I think, right, so what we tend to see that many synthetic, well, for example, right, so one of the most potent serotonergic psychedelics is Brahma dragonfly,
Mm.
which is toxic, or another psychedelic, and boom, for example, right, that was used as a tracer, does have some toxicity, whereas most of the naturally occurring psychedelics, they are ones of the least toxic substances known by humans. And like one way to evaluate toxicity of a substance is to divide the dose that can potentially kill you versus the dose that induces the effects that you're after, right? For caffeine, this ratio is about 60-70. If you take 70 shots of espresso, you may die. For
Mm.
alcohol, it's about 10 or 12. So, if a person, who is not a drinker, drinks, 1.5 liters of strong alcohol, he or she may die. And for most of the classical psychedelics, this ratio is a matter of thousands or
Yeah.
hundreds. And someone did an estimate of how many dried mushrooms one needs to consume to actually inflict any physical damage, and ended up, uh, I can't remember how to convert it in pounds, but about 11 kilograms of dried mushrooms.
Wow.
It's I don't know. It's not feasible to consume it.
Right.
So the point that I'm making, um, well, for a very long time, and again, so I'm coming from a country that has a history of having this mentality of building a human that is the master of nature, right?
Hmm.
That would domesticate nature. That
Right.
would, yeah, there were several projects in Soviet Union to turn the rivers, right, for the benefits of human civilization. It was a massive experiment, and I'm saying this not in a condescending way.
Right.
I am saying this as I would talk about a massive experiment that was conducted at the scale of an entire population of an entire country, that we have tremendous amount of results to learn from, and it hasn't been effective. Let's put it this way. And over the course of our lives as a humanity, we've learned that it's a dangerous game trying to outsmart nature.
Yep.
And my personal stance is that we just need to study and comprehend that we are an inseparable part of it.
Yep.
We are not
Yeah.
the masters, the owners of nature. We are their we are her children.
Yeah. I love it. I think of the Alan Watts line that the earth grows people like an apple tree grows apples.
Yeah.
It's pretty beautiful to think about on that aspect. There's been some some papers written. I can't cite them, and I don't know exactly. I don't even know if I read it in a medical journal, but they were using 5-MeO-T to help people with Alzheimer's disease, and it could be anecdotal evidence. I'm not sure. Have you heard any things or read any published papers where they have found success using psychedelics with neurodegenerative diseases?
Right now, there are no systematic clinical trials that would, show these effects.
Mm-hmm.
There is one phase 2 clinical trial, I think, that was initiated this year. Was it in Argentina? Maybe, yeah, yeah, with 5-MeO-DMT. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the one you're talking about. And when it comes to the preclinical evidence, I think it's clear, it's there, right?
Mm.
So I studied, and I'm saying this as someone who spent fair amount of years studying neurobiological
Right.
plasticity. So clearly, classical psychedelics are capable of promoting neurobiological plasticity, learning associated with it. There is a series of papers where psychedelics were called psychoplastogens, right, for that incredible ability to stimulate
Psychoplastogens.
neurobiological plasticity. And we know that plasticity is largely harmed in neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia. That was the focus of my work for also, for many years. And for me, this is a clear rationale. Moreover, back in the days when I was just starting working with that, and we had a conversation in the department when we were running our studies with cognitive training. And of course, for me, I thought that's what we need to investigate, it's what we needed to study. But back then, it was not feasible to launch a study with psychedelics in Sweden. To tell you, you know, a little bit more about the background, when the Swedish Network for Psychedelic Science was started, thanks to which, to a very large extent, we were able to run uh, our first clinical trial. I talked to my colleagues, and I mean, there were lots of people who were very positive about the potential of psychedelics for basic science, for mental health. But they said, well, I mean, Alex, yes, we understand, but let's be realistic. That's something that is never going to happen in Sweden in the near future. And I think, well, maybe in a couple of years after that, everything went quite smoothly. Once there was funding, I mean, I had experience interacting with agencies that are like the analogs of FDA,
Yeah.
and it went smoothly. But the point, it's I'm just to narrow down my answer.
Yeah.
So I do think it's a very promising area of research, and I that was one of the things that I proposed back in the days. I remember Amanda Fielding, when she was
Hmm.
in Sweden. So she was the one also in favor of that kind of research. And but yeah, I communicated it um to exploring the possibility of running that. And it was very hard. I mean, it was very, very hard to work with other pharmacological substances, even like the ones that are very well studied, like L-DOPA, for example. It was
Hmm.
very hard to get through, and that was not the right time for that kind of studies. And now I'm happy to see that this research is gradually being prioritized, and I do think it has a tremendous potential, not only for Alzheimer's but also for Parkinson's, like all age-related neurodegenerative conditions.
It's so fascinating to think about. Like, if we think about psychedelics and when they enter the zeitgeist or when they enter the society, isn't it fascinating to think that this part of this generation, the baby boomers, who are now getting to the point where they may have neurodegenerative diseases, we're one wave where they experimented with them. Thus, they might be more open to using them later. It's this beautiful tapestry in a way to see it coming back around to help out these people that medicine's opening back up to it on some level. I guess it brings me to this idea of degenerational shifts in attitudes merely reflect changing cultural tides, or do technologies and drugs play a role in reshaping mindsets?
Mhm. Interesting that you brought up the baby boomers. I watched some of the videos on your channel. Sorry,
Thank
I
you.
cannot call the name. I can't remember. So with all due respect, that was well put. Why considering the 60s and the amount of psychedelics taken by baby boomers, why are we not living in an enlightened society, right?
Right.
That's so beautifully put. And again, so that's I think a partial answer to your question. I
Yeah.
don't think that psychedelics are the answer. They are one of the tools that we have,
Yeah.
and we still, all of us, need to do personal work and be proactively involved in shaping the way we interact and treat each other.
Yeah.
And
It's
technology, yes, right now we are living in a peculiar moment, right? That to some extent, the technology, some may argue, may be a little bit ahead of our
yeah.
psychological and spiritual development. And you know, um, at the ceremonies, um, anyone who participated in psychedelic ceremonies understands that there are difficult moments that affect all actors in the circle. And sometimes it may be tempting to point fingers to, well, how horrible it's all, oh, how it's all happening. That shouldn't be done this way. But these are the exact moments when everyone needs to exercise patience and respect to each other and look inwards. And that's what I think we all need to do now at different levels. Um, um, and yes, so when the technology or any progress is happening too fast, when there is a roller coaster of experience, where there is a roller coaster of changes that we
Mm-hmm.
are undergoing to, that's when um, that's when our ability to look inwards and be patient and calm and respectful are becoming paramount.
Yeah. I when I think about ceremony sometimes and respectful and psychedelics, one trend or one thing that I've been talking to people about, this thing that comes up is the way in the West, at least in the United States, that we treat death. Death is something I just recently learned, like the etymology of palliative care. Like pal means the shroud. So palliative care means to shroud death. And it makes me want to cry. It kind of gives me goosebumps. Like that's how
Yeah.
we treat death here. It's like, don't look at it, be afraid of it. It's so scary. Oh, we hate it. We hate it so much. We're going to keep people alive even when their spirit may have left them already. Like my grandma was just a vegetable for so long. And they have these codes. They don't even have a code for deaths because they can't, you know what I mean? It's like on
Yes.
some level, it's this relationship to death that we're deathly afraid of, and it robs the dignity of it, and somehow it robs all of us of life in some ways. Like,
Yes.
I'm sad about that. I'm wondering if I can get your opinions with that, and maybe can psychedelics on some level help us work with that strategy? What do you think?
Mhm. Um, I am going to speak from on my own
Sure,
opinion, right? Not
please.
as a scientist, even though there is some science done on the fear of death, not only on psychedelics. Um, to me, the societal um, phobia of death and everything related to dying is also a reflection of a crisis of meaning.
Yeah.
Um, because, well, we are talking right now, and just a few days ago, well, uh, Roland Griffiths passed away, right?
Yes.
Who is, for me, was one of the most influential people in the modern psychedelic science. And you can see how it's very touching. It's very touching how he passed away. And you can see that this person lived very profound and meaningful life. And there was no, well, I don't dare to say that there was no fear of death. I think it's
Sure.
natural. It's embedded in the very foundation of our biology, of our existence. But there was acceptance and and peace.
Mm.
And I think what brings peace um, in many challenging situations is the sense of meaning, right? I understand. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, and that's there is like a 5-minute solution to find
Hmm.
meaning and to find something that you're not afraid to die for.
Mm.
But if someone manages to find that something that is worth dying for, um, then suddenly it does not become that scary, I think. Um, and yes, to me, the right, there is an extreme saying by Charles Bukowski: "Find what you like and let it kill you." It's a very Bukowski way of
Right.
saying that, but there is some truth to it, I think, and because on a grand scale, a human life is a very short moment,
Hmm.
and it's very easy to get lost in all the floods of information that we are dealing,
Yep.
all the demands that we are seeing in social media. You have to be an ideal father, an ideal worker, um, and forget about what fulfills our lives with meanings. Yeah, it's a reflection out loud, but I just to give you a very short and packaged answer. So to me, uh, I do think that to a large extent we lost this connection to, well, the lost connection to death, to nature, and to meaning are very intricately related to me.
Yeah, that's really well said. It For me, like I have found recently, maybe it's my age. I'm almost 50, and maybe it's my age, but I believe it's also my relationship with psychedelics that allowed me to confront that the life I had been living for quite some time was a lie. It was in some ways it allowed me to see the absurdity of chasing things that are really shiny, and that it allowed me to chase the meaning that was already packaged up and there for me to take, rather than provide meaning for myself. And
Yes,
it's scary. It's really scary to get to that point and see it and be like, I can't do it anymore. Like, especially like, and like, it's so interesting because I think on some level, that's when you start to live a little bit. Like when you know what I mean? There's that saying that says, if you die before you die, you never die. But like, it's really damn hard to walk away from a living when you have a family, when you have all these
yes,
bills, when you have a mortgage, when, hey, what's my wife going to say when I say I'm leaving this place? And then but on some level, it's that very move that will allow you to have a conversation with your wife that you've never had in your life.
I
It'll allow you to
entirely
have a
agree.
conversation with your daughter about, I'm going to do this so that she can see that you're supposed to do this. You know what I mean? And like, I get goosebumps when I think about it,
Yes, me too.
and I think I know for me, psychedelics played a role in finding the courage to do it. And it's on this, maybe it speaks to the idea of your relationship with uncertainty. And maybe that speaks to death too, right? On some level.
Yes, thank you for saying this. I just wanted to say that it resonates deeply uh, with me, what you're saying, and um, when it comes to work with psychedelics, there were several attempts in my career when I tried to steer away from them, um, to do different things, that would not put my career at risk, that would bring more predictable things to life. Um, but that's ultimately I felt that I couldn't do that because that was not giving me the fulfillment, and now I learned uh, that as a scientist, I cannot research. I cannot dedicate my life to researching what I don't believe in. And of course, even what I believe in, I need to question and put to test and just remain genuine. And that's a hard path of a scientist, right? To question your own beliefs. And
Yeah.
but what I wanted to say, um, the ability to be honest with your own aspirations, with your own desires, about your own life, what matters and what doesn't. Very often it's one of the hardest things to do, but that's the thing that is very closely linked to. Okay, so I disappeared for a second. I don't know what happened.
A
That was
cliffhanger.
that's a cool moment.
That was beautiful in a way.
Oh, I'm back. I'm back. I don't know what happened. So that's the thing that is most delicately and closely linked to our well-being and meaning in life. And at this point, I cannot see my life without this sense and the ability to be honest with myself, with what matters and what does not.
It's it's so closely tied with scripture in some ways about being reborn again or death and a rebirth, and I can't help
Yeah.
but like it just maybe instead of scriptures you could use Sufi poetry,
Yes.
but I mean it's probably better, but
Yeah.
like
I
it's
we
so
had that
connected.
joke. Well, we had that. I was joking when we were preparing an application to our Swedish analog of FDA for our study on psilocybin. Uh, I mean, it's very hard to sell an idea to that organization that the best experience you may possibly have as an experience of your own death. But I mean, at the same time, it's that's true.
Mm,
Um, there is a lot of symbolic and
mhm.
personal value in these sorts of experiences. And yeah, I agree with you that well, that's a good way of putting it. Dying once makes you not being afraid of dying next time, for
Yeah.
real. Yeah.
It's so fascinating to think about. I'm mesmerized by it, and Dr. Alexander exceeded all my expectations. I truly thank you for a very candid conversation and laying out your opinion next to what you think about scientifically. That's almost unheard of, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to spend with me to talk about all your opinions, to talk about all the research you've been doing, to thank you for the papers you've been publishing. But before I let you go, maybe you can tell us a couple things. One is, where can people find you? What do you have coming up? And what are you most excited about?
Yeah. I Well, right now, I mean, I'm stationed in Sweden right now. It's uh, it's an interesting time for me at the moment. It hasn't been the best time to be a Russian, but each day I humbly accept the challenges life throws my way, cherishing what remains or what hasn't been taken from me. I'm grateful for the moments I share with my
Yeah.
daughter, the liberty to pursue my research, and the roof over my head. Sadly, many people don't have even this these
Mm.
days. So people can find me in person in Sweden, because the way I was welcomed in the research community back in the days of the first year in my medical school, whenever I get requests from students, I am doing my best. I always do my best to at least meet over coffee, to listen to the people, to know how I can be of help, even if, on the surface it doesn't seem like there is a place at the lab, for example. So, if people want to meet me in person, so just they can email me. They just Google Alexander Lebedev Karolinska. There is my professional email. Um, what I am up to right now. So we launched a startup in Sweden, leveraging dream analytics, allowing people to explore their unconscious. For me, okay, I'm trying to think how I can unpack it
Yeah.
within a fixed amount of time.
Take your time. Take your time, man.
Um, right. So there were different ways to reintroduce the things we've talked about to the Western society. Connection to nature, the way to connect with each other, to our spiritual roots. And we learned that the New Age way is probably not the way for the Western society. But I do think that technology, specifically, some of the tools that we have right now, allowing people to make sense of the experiences that are very hard to make sense just by reading them and trying to interpret them rationally. I think that technology have a tremendous capacity to show us that we all intricately connected,
Yeah, me too.
and that's what the dream seer is all about. It's an immersive experience that we are building, and we are building it with the community. Um, right now, we are running our um, alpha testing phase, receiving wonderful feedback. Dreamseer is a story of our days. It's a narrative that is being told not only by me, not by the co-founders. It's the narrative that is being told by all of us, and that's the startup that um, we initiated. So there are scientists, programmers, artists that are involved in creating it in the quest to resurrect and explore the new ways we can evolve and connect with each other.
That
Sorry, I
sounds
can.
fascinating. No, it's maybe we could talk more about it. Like what like when you say it's a narrative, is it like a documentary? Is it something that I put a headset onto? Is it something that it's interactive and immersive, or do I see it in a dream? Like, maybe tell me more about it, man. It sounds fascinating.
Practically, the most simplistic way and the way to describe the technology, it's a dream analytics app. Okay, so that's the
Okay.
most reductionistic way to describe it.
Okay.
You wake up in the morning, you activate voice to text or type
Okay.
your dream. Um, you get the feedback on the occurring themes and sentiments that you have in your dream. And each individual dream has a unique set of coordinates in a shared space. And there is a narrative that evolves based on the dreams that people see. that we all see. There is also a story to tell about the dream realm, and that's something that Carl Jung was studying and described in the dreams of his patients and his own dreams and before the Second World War.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and we know right now there is one of the most prevalent theory of dreams and dreaming is the continuity hypothesis that dreams are reflective of what's happening in our own mental space. And I, with this technology, we are trying to revisit, test, expand, and explore some of the ideas, some of the old ideas, including ideas of Jung about our shared mental space. And there is a narrative. So there is a story that is being told. Uh, there is a something like a visual novel that evolves. There is a lore. There is a lore in that we shape together with the community.
So, do you think, a lot of there's a lot of I've heard people say that Jung's Red Book was his adventure into psychedelics. Have you heard that?
Yes, interestingly, Carl Jung himself was quite skeptical, let's put it this way, about psychedelics. He saw them as potentially dangerous when an unprepared mind enters this realm. Um, of course, he has his own indigenous, very powerful non-ordinary states of consciousness. But among psychedelic therapists, there are many people with Jungian background, and it does not surprise me. And yes, I do think that some of the concepts introduced by Carl Jung, while they may look bizarre by some accounts, I think right now we have tools to rigorously investigate and verify or on the other hand reject them. So we'll see. For me, Jung was not the entrance to psychedelic research. It was rather the other way around. I first encountered Jung and Jungian ideas. I think that was the first year in the med school too, when I first came to the Department of Psychiatry, and one of the first assignment that I was given by my first teacher before I joined the group doing brain imaging, one of the first assignments was to write a report on where voices are coming from.
Mm.
And I was fascinated by neuroscience. I created I think, a decent report by student standards on neurobiology of voices happening in some schizophrenia spectrum disorders.
Mm.
There was enough imaging work, neurophysiological work on that. So my teacher read it and said it's beautifully written, but where the voices are coming from? Why do we see different narratives? Why do we see transformation of different objects that are, well, if it is a persecutory ideas or persecutory voices, why do we see this transformation of changes in different cultural contexts? And I realized that I didn't have an answer for that based on the information that I've collected. And later I learned that he was Jungian. I tried reading Jung when I was in the first year, so it didn't land well. So I was very skeptical. Um, but that inability to answer a question was something that really stuck with me, and that eventually stimulated my development as a researcher, and in some way probably led me to study psychedelics, to study socionomics, the global societal dynamics, and I think it's probably one of the most valuable gifts that I've received during my education. This simple assignment and the question that challenged my views. So that's how I got into Jung and eventually ended up completing my own analysis in Jungian framework.
So where do the voices come from?
I think that we have good reasons to believe that the way our society interacts brings emergent properties into our dynamics that may also continue to influence our behavior at large. Some of these ideas resonate with one of the godfathers of modern sociology, Emil Durkheim. He
Mm.
authored a massive work on suicide that was called Suicide.
Mm.
And his concept was that, one of the reasons of the mental, and he predicted deterioration of mental health crisis and the suicide crisis in particular. That was one of the first work, like really massive work on sociology. And his idea was that, there is a paradox that despite being connected with each other based on our skills, and the society is becoming more interdependent, we are becoming more disconnected from each other on a spiritual and personal level, and that what brings a lot of challenges to our lives and our mental health in particular. Anyhow, so he was one of the first to talk about this societal dynamics, that some of the concepts may continue to exist and influence our behavior. One example, Christmas, right? There are not that many people who actually believe in the in the in the whole story, right? But it's also a celebration that has a massive history and also from an anthropological account. But this is the concept that keeps determining massively the way we behave, starting from basic things like shopping patterns. So that's a massive construct that continues to influence that. And I think that that's true for many of the driving forces in our society. I don't know where my own ideas are coming from. I don't.
Mm.
Creativity is itself is a very interesting thing, right? So
Yeah.
I um, I don't have a definite answer, right? So where the voices, where creative thoughts, where the ideas are coming from, I think there are good reasons to believe that we are not fully, and I know it's a dangerous way of putting it, especially for a scientist, fully responsible and fully authoring the ideas that we are bringing and communicating.
Yep.
But yes, we are responsible in the way we are communicating it, probably in the way we shape them. But the origin of creative ideas, novelty, revelations, is continues to be a mystery that I'm trying to dedicate my life to understand.
It's so true. I mean, you can scroll through biographies or YouTube videos, or I've talked to plenty of people where they've written a book, and a large portion of people say the same thing. Like, this was written through me. I felt like it came right through me. I've been on really high doses of like 4-ACO DMT, and I'll never forget the first time I heard a voice in my head. It scared me to death. Like, I remember like curled up like a frightened cat in the bathtub, like, what? Whoa! And for a moment I'm like, oh my, later, after I got through the experience, like the next day I was like, I can't imagine having that experience. Like, imagine having that all the time. You don't know what it is. Like, wow. And that brings us back to the idea of, maybe in the 60s or 50s, they did research where the professional would take the drug so they could understand psychosis. Like, that's a brilliant move. Like, you really get an insight from there, from understanding from a perspective what it's like, or even like really high doses where you think things that could be considered way out in left field. And then later you kind of come back to this rational understanding, whatever that means, and you're like, that was so real. I still believe it in some ways.
Yeah.
There's so much more going on than we really have any idea.
Yes.
Man, have you read Julian Jaynes' book, The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind?
I haven't read it fully. I'm familiar with the concept. A good colleague of mine, we talked about it with a good colleague of mine, Robin Carhart Harris. Yes. Yeah, but I mean, I haven't read the entire book. I'm familiar
Right.
with the concepts. Yes, I find them interesting.
Fascinating to think about a corresponding part to Broca's area and Wernicke's area in the opposite side of the brain that may be responsible for voices.
Yes. Yes.
Man. So here's another one. Now that I'm thinking about it a little bit, when we think about synesthesia, do we know? It sounds to me like that could be information being processed in the visual cortex, or information being processed, or visual information being processed in like the sound part of our brains. Do we know what's going on there when synesthesia happens?
Yes. Actually, a good colleague of mine here in Sweden is studying or used to study synesthesia. Um, well, first, right. So when we are talking about, for lack of a better word, normal waking consciousness. So the networks, there are some networks that usually do not interact or interact very little. Visual network, auditory network. So there is a certain amount of segregation between them. So what we see happening during psychedelic experiences and what we see in people with synesthesia is that there is more crosstalk between these
Mm.
networks, as compared to non-synesthesic. Is there such a word? In people without synesthesia, in normal waking consciousness.
If we look at the way learning is and forgive me if I get this wrong, but if we look at learning as a strengthening in connections between different parts of the brain, is it possible that if someone experiences synesthesia often, that can become a normal pathway, maybe leading to more creativity in some ways?
I think creativity, or some create aspects of creativity, right? It's very intricately related to the ability to see connections that are not
Right,
obvious.
right.
And in that sense, I mean, I don't have data to support it that it may actually be linked to better creativity. I think there are studies showing that synesthesia is more prevalent in creative specialties, but don't quote me on that. Uh, Creativity, right? So there are different ways to conceptualize creativity. Say artistic creativity, creativity of an abstract visual artist, as compared to creativity of an engineer
Hmm.
or a scientist. Um, well, the way we operationalize creativity in the lab when we are administering tests for creativity, like Torrance test for creative thinking, or alternative use test, which is a very simple task. You have a word brick, you have 5 minutes to come up with as many
Right.
potential uses for that word. So there are two aspects of creativity the way it is operationalized in the lab. It should be novel, unusual, and useful. And in that sense, I think that in a way maybe more flexible patterns of brain dynamics linked to the exchange of information between the regions that usually interact little may introduce an extra capacity to get new insights, to look on a situation or a problem under a different angle. So there were actually some studies done in the pre-prohibition era, among entrepreneurs, scientists trying to solve a problem for a very long time, and then undergoing a psychedelic session, discovering novel solutions. Uh, in that sense, I do think that this aspect of creativity, the ability to look at the problem under a new angle, I think there is a story to tell about that. It does not still exclude the ability to make sense of this novel look. And one of the, that there is a link between psychosis and creativity. We know that
Mm.
people among siblings of people with creative professions, there are more relatives suffering from psychosis spectrum disorders. There are studies linking some traits like psychoticism to creativity. And there are studies showing that if it's, like polygenic risk score studies, so people who score high on polygenic risk scores for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder while not having a psychiatric condition, meaning that their genome resembles more of those with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, are more likely to have creative professions.
Mm.
And um, so it's there is a link, and there are some groups that believe that schizophrenia and psychosis itself is a side effects of a tremendous expansion of our creative abilities as the Homo sapiens to discover patterns, to adopt. And when perhaps this ability is not met with the capacity to contain and to incorporate this ability to perceive unusual patterns, it can go overboard and compromise a sane, for lack of a better word, reality perception and connection to reality. So to me, creativity is an interesting dance
Yeah.
between subjective and objective reality, and all about an ability of an individual to befriend your subjective or internal and external reality.
That's a beautiful answer. I was speaking with Dr. Jessica Rochester a while back, and she had mentioned that I don't know if she read it somewhere or who she was citing, but there were some indigenous people that came to the United States and were mesmerized by seeing some of the people that were in the hospitals and were, it's that, and that had psychosis. And they're like, "What are you doing? These are the people that see patterns that no one else does." And I have had an incredible time here, Dr. Alexander. I could probably talk to you another 2 hours, and I am super thankful for everything that you've put out there and that we've talked about today, and for all the work you're doing. And you've been very gracious with your time. And uh, is there anything else that you want to leave people with before we turn it over?
No, I think we covered a lot.
So
Similar
much.
to you, I'm sure if we had more time, we would find lots of topics for the
Yeah.
conversation. It's been a really great pleasure talking to you, George. It's been one of the these were, well, probably one of the greatest questions I've been asked on the interview. So thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to 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 be present in this interview. Thank you for having me, and I'm wishing all of us patience, um, and and compassion.
Yeah. I think hands down, you're one of the most brilliant researchers out there, and what you're adding to the field is phenomenal. And anybody who is listening right now, check out his discography. He's got tons of incredible work out there, and it's wonderful. And thanks again. If you hang on real briefly afterwards, I'll talk to you just real briefly afterwards. But to everyone listening right now, aloha. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you have a beautiful day. And that's all I got. Aloha.
Thank you.